Folks, good morning, and welcome to what I hope will be an interesting and informative talk. My name is Shuck Pross. I'd like to take you through, be a guide to a journey through some of the parts of World War II that are less known. Many of you remember the Victory at Sea series that NBC did in the early 50s. And a lot of that was done way before a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today was declassified. In fact, some of this material was classified as late as 1980. And so a lot of the history books are either incomplete and in some cases downright wrong. Before I get any further, I'd like to thank John Holderman for doing some proofreading of this thing, as well as Dr. Edelstein over there, who also helped with some of the proofreading work. With that, let's get started. Code breaking is a branch of cryptography. As I said, not too many people know much about it, and that's done on purpose. And very few know that it affected the outcome of World War II the way it did. And as I said, much was classified until the mid-1980s. Winston Churchill is reported to have said, "In war, the truth is so precious that it must always be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies." So we've been told a lot of lies because this particular branch of intelligence is very, very critical. And if the other side finds out that you're reading their codes, they change them and you go blind. I'd like to talk about four things. I want to give a brief description of cryptography and cryptanalysis. I want to provide a little bit of introduction to some of the history of it, describe the cryptanalysis that occurred a little bit in World War I and mostly in World War II, and then we'll talk about the quantum leaps that were taken during World War II in that field. So first, let's get all on the same page so that we understand the terminology. What is encryption? Encryption is taking a message or a file and changing it so it can be sent somewhere, and if it's intercepted, it's not readable. It's gibberish to whoever intercepts that and doesn't have the key to unlock it. And the key is the method that creates the encryption and the reversing decryption. We're going to see an example. No, I don't need that, thank you. I have a loud voice. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. Okay. We're going to talk about two things, ciphers and codes. We use the terms interchangeably, I do too, but at least you should know that they are different things. A code is a word or a set of numbers that stands for an entire sentence or a phrase, such as the word wallaby could mean attack at dawn. A cipher, on the other hand, deals with changing letters. We're going to see an example of a cipher, a very simple cipher, very shortly. A couple of more definitions. Cryptography, and by the way, these are not used universally. These are the definitions that I'm going to be using here in this talk. Cryptography is the science of encryption. It's the way of coming up with an algorithm that allows you to change what's readable into something that's not readable, and very hard for somebody to read that doesn't know the key. Cryptanalysis, of course, is the science of breaking the codes and ciphers without knowing the key. For a long time, it was thought that that couldn't be done, but it was done with a lot of success in World War II. And cryptology is the science combining both cryptography and cryptanalysis. So there's basically are the definitions of what we're going to be talking about today. We tend to think of cryptography as something that's fairly recent, but in fact, it's been around for centuries. Back in the 5th century BC, the Spartans needed to send messages, and they needed to encrypt those messages. And so cryptography goes back as far as 2,500 years ago. Cryptography seems to have sprung up in many places in the world as soon as a society gets to a certain level of literacy. When you get to a certain level of literacy, you need to be able to communicate privately. The military needs to do it. Businesses in trade agreements need to do it. So it seems that it almost shows up by itself in many different parts of the world, but it's been around for many centuries. The first use of cryptography in political affairs that we know about came from Julius Caesar. He had an interesting key, and here's an example of a very simple key. Whenever he wanted to write the letter A, he didn't. He wrote the letter D. When he wanted to write the letter B, he wrote the letter E. And he wanted to write the letter F, he wrote the letter C. So the key was move everything down 3 places in the alphabet. So when now that produced a message that was gibberish. When I receive the message, all I have to do is rewrite those letters by moving them to the left 3 letters, and now I can read the message. So that was a very simple key, but understand that's what a key is. A key is a method by which you can take something that's readable and make it non-readable and reverse later on so the message becomes readable. Cryptanalysis, which I said is the breaking of the message or the code without knowing how it was originally encoded. For a long time, they didn't think that could be done. But the Arabs were the first to discover and write down the methods of cryptanalysis. How did they do it? Well, they considered letters in the Quran, but we're going to take another simple example. Let's take a message that you have that's encrypted. You can't read it. But you notice that the letter Q appears more often than any other letter. The most used letter in the English language is what? The letter E. It could be that Q is E. Interesting. Now you find the letter V is the second most used letter in the cryptogram. The second most used letter in the English language is the letter T. There's other clues that we can use. If you find a common letter following the letter T, what would you think that letter would be? H. Usually following the letter T, most often it's the letter H. This, the, that, those are very common words that we use. So by using a combination of frequency analysis and looking at what letters touch other letters frequently, we can start to break the code. And some early codes, in fact, were broken using exactly this method. So we had to come up with other methods. We'll talk about some of those methods shortly. But modern cryptology starts with the Civil War, but it only played a minor role because in order to break a code, you have to intercept that message in its coded form. But intercepting a message during the Civil War meant either stopping a courier on horseback or a runner, or you had to tap a telegraph line behind enemy lines. Not easy to do. And so cryptography during the Civil War, or cryptanalysis during the Civil War, played a relatively minor role because they didn't need to use it because it was so hard to get the message. Interesting thing happened during World War I. The American public was very, very much against getting into that war. There was tremendous sentiment. Let the Europeans fight it out. Let's stay out of it. But Germany sent a coded letter to Mexico that was intercepted by England. There's a whole story about this. You can write a book about it, so I'm going to condense it. But basically what Germany said is they were going to soon start unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, during World War I, we were sending supplies to England to help them out. Unrestricted submarine warfare was going to mean what? It was going to mean they were going to sink American ships. And of course, that was going to likely to cause the U.S. to enter the war. But the telegram said something else. They tried to induce Mexico to make war with the U.S. They said in the telegram, we'll make war together, we'll make peace together. They promised Mexico that they could re-annex the states that they had lost to America, California, Arizona, New Mexico. They also promised them financial aid. England decrypted that telegram, and through some subterfuge, which I'm not going to go into right now, they told the United States, and that precipitated us getting into the war. When the American public found out that Germany was trying to get Mexico to attack us, that changed a lot of sentiment in this country. And we entered, and that entry changed the outcome of World War I. But as I said, cryptography, cryptanalysis remained relatively unused. But radio changed things. That was the game changer. It allowed armies for the first time to rapidly coordinate an attack. Information could be sent out, everybody would get it, and you could coordinate attacks. The only problem was everybody that was listening knew what you were going to do. So it wasn't practical to use radio unless you encrypted your messages. That was the only way to use radio in a practical way. Now, radio really exploded in its use during World War II because armies and navies could finally exchange intelligence, they could synchronize their efforts, and they could receive orders. Germany really used radio to coordinate blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg would have been impossible without radio. You have to consider a few things. Britain is an island and does not have a lot of raw materials. They're dependent upon imports. You probably already know that the German submarines were sinking 50% of the materials being sent from Canada, the US, Australia. 50% of that stuff was going to the bottom of the sea. Britain was darn near starving. And they were not all that far from having to give in. The other problem was we had to transport our troops over to England in preparation for D-Day. D-Day would have been impossible launching from the United States. We had to have a base to build up material and men so we could invade Europe. Had we not won the submarine war, that would have been impossible. And the submarine war was won because we had broken the German naval code. Or I should say the English had broken the German naval code. Again, you can write books, an encyclopedia, about how this was done. Can't talk about that now. But Germany needed to position its U-boats at sea, and for that, radio communication was vital. By breaking the code that they used for the U-boats, we could move around the U-boats. We could circumvent the wolf packs. Not only that, but once we knew where the subs were, we could send out destroyers to get them. And eventually, we won that part of the war. Another thing that was very interesting, remember the bombing of London? During the Battle of Britain, Germany continuously bombed English cities. The attempt was to deplete the Royal Air Force. But because of radar, which is another topic which I'm going to talk about next year in a talk that I'm doing now, but because we had also broken their communications, we knew where and when these attacks were going to occur. And they were able to conserve enough of their planes during each raid so that eventually Germany gave up trying to invade Britain. Probably one of the most important things that cryptography did, it allowed us to even have a D-Day. Germany's preparations for D-Day were sent by radio. Okay? We had to know where to land. There were many choices. And if we had chosen to land in a place where Germany had amassed most of their forces, we would have lost. Would have been another Dunkirk. We had to know where their forces were, and luckily they told us. They sent information about what the strength of their forces were and where they were located. So when we decided to attack the coast of France, we knew exactly. In fact, there were 64 divisions there. We knew where 62 of them were and had their strength, what materials they had. We had all that prior knowledge because of radio and decryption. Again, I'm going to repeat this. If the war in the Atlantic or the D-Day landing had failed, we may be speaking German. There's no guarantee that we would have won if D-Day failed, or we couldn't get to Britain in the first place to launch D-Day. If Hitler had succeeded in conquering Great Britain, again, World War II could have ended with a very, very different outcome. Cryptanalysis was the essential element in winning all these battles. There's an old saying which I believe I attribute to an ancient Chinese general. And what he said was, battles are won before they are fought. Now, you may or may not agree with that completely, but it certainly has an element of truth. The better prepared you are to fight the battle, the higher the probability that you're going to win the battle. So that was his saying. Battles are won before they're fought. And we're going to see a very interesting example of that in a few minutes. On the Eastern Front, which was the battle with Russia, there's a battle called the Battle of Kursk. You may have heard of it. It was the largest tank battle in history. I think 2,000 tanks clashed. We had found out about that battle through breaking the German codes. We told Uncle Joe, Stalin, and he was prepared, and the result of which Russia was able to rout the Germans. Until the Battle of Kursk, Germany was on the offensive. They were winning. The Russians were being pushed back little by little by little. After the Battle of Kursk, everything changed. All of a sudden, the Russians were winning. And the tanks of Germany were depleted significantly, that they had to back up. And that was the turning point of the war in the East. England broke the German codes. We helped, but they did most of the work. However, the breaking of the Japanese codes and ciphers was the work of the Americans. And in a large extent, it parallels what was done to the German codes. You've heard of the Battle of Midway. It's a very famous battle. What you may not know is we won that battle with a significantly inferior force. We had far less ships, far less planes than Japan had. But we had one advantage. We knew they were coming. We knew when they were coming. And they didn't know that we knew. We sat off their flank at the appropriate time. We swooped down on them, and it was a very fast battle. And I think in something like 4 or 5 minutes, 3 or 4 of their carriers were sunk. We lost one. We could recover because we had the capacity to recover. Japan did not have the resources. From that point on, that was the turning point in the war with Japan. From that point on, before that, they were winning. We were losing. From that point on, they were on the defensive, and we were winning. They were the ones that were surprised, not us. There's another interesting victory, a psychological victory that we won. The guy that planned Pearl Harbor was Isoko Yamamoto. He was the admiral. In fact, he was the head of all of the Japanese Navy. He was educated at Harvard, knew America very, very well, spoke English, and knew the psyche of America. He was a very aggressive and determined individual, and he was a prophet of air power. He was considered Japan's strongest leader. In the spring of 1943, he decided to come down to the island of Rabaul to take personal charge of a deteriorating situation in the Solomon Islands. He planned a one-day morale and inspection tour of the bases in the Upper Solomons. But of course, those bases had to be alerted. You have to know the big boss is coming, right? Got to put on your best clothes, clean things up a lot. So they broadcast Yamamoto's itinerary, of course, in code. Yeah. We were listening, and we had also broken the code. We knew that during that day, the admiral was come closer to the combat zone than he had ever done before. The decryption of that message amounted to his death warrant. We knew that the death of the commander-in-chief would demoralize the Japanese, which it did. They venerate their captains much more than we do. And the elimination of the finest strategist that the enemy had amounted to an American battle victory. World War II was kind of unique. The first time in history, and probably the last time, where one side had virtually open access to the military communications of the other side. World War II was no slam dunk. We won it, but it was a hard battle. And yet, we had a seat right at Hitler's planning table. We knew what was going to happen, we knew when it was going to happen, and with that, it was a massive, massive effort to win World War II. So you can imagine what would have happened if we didn't have that kind of information. If we won the war, it would have taken years longer. Cryptanalysis is very important. And the higher up you go, the more important it becomes. At the front, it's about equal to prisoner of war intelligence or maybe aerial reconnaissance. But you can't match cryptanalysis for understanding the strategy of the enemy and what their overall plan is and how they intend to execute it. Intelligence chiefs love cryptanalysis. It's the cheapest, it's the latest, and it's the best source of information because you're listening to the enemy talk to themselves. What better source of information can you get? Cryptanalysis can alter the status quo. Code making can at best conserve it. Having good codes can help you keep the status quo, but cryptanalysis can alter it. World War II had another interesting aspect to it. It was the first time when we went to machines to create our ciphers and codes. Prior to that, ciphers and codes were a pencil and paper affair. People, you saw the thing with Julius Caesar. He had to sit down with a paper, and when he wanted to write an A, he wrote a D, and so on and so forth. All paper and pencil. There's just so much you can do with paper and pencil. Modern warfare entails a huge amount of communications. There aren't enough pencils and paper pads in the world to have that kind of communication volume. Can't happen. So we had to find some way to increase or decrease the amount of labor and increase the speed at which codes and ciphers could be written. World War II was the first war that made widespread use of cipher machines. They greatly increased the complexity of the ciphers because now the machine was doing the encrypting. You didn't have a pencil and paper anymore, so you could do much, much more because the machine was doing it. In fact, it was originally thought that the breaking of a machine-generated cipher was absolutely impossible. And Germany believed that to the end of the war. They had absolute faith in their machine. Their machine was called the Enigma. Now, they were electromechanical, mostly mechanical, and they were developed as a commercial product. Around mid-1920s, a company came out with a machine, and it was designed basically for commercial use. Banks, insurance companies, stock trading, anybody that needed to be able to send a telegram privately. Yeah, militaries used them too, and they were good, and they were thought to be impenetrable. Now, this gets a little bit, I know we said this was going to be non-technical. This part is going to be a little bit, if you find it, if you understand it, fine. If not, the Enigmas were based upon a rotor. Now, you don't know what a rotor is because if you had a car during the 1980s, you know what the odometer looked like? A bunch of numbers on a drum, and when one number rotated, it kicked the next number up by one. When that rotated around, it kicked the next number up by one. That's what a rotor is. And the Enigma had 3 rotors, and later in the war, some of them had 4. But the difference that did to the pencil and paper method was this. Whenever you saw the letter D, In the Roman code, you knew that it was an A. Every single time. It didn't change. But in the Enigma, the first time you pressed the letter N, it came out as an X. Press the letter N again, it's a B. Again, it's a Q. So there was no way to predict with any certainty each time you pressed a letter, it would come out as a different letter. So it was much, much harder to break that code. You couldn't do a simple frequency analysis or what letter touches another letter. Much, much more complex. The Germans did one better. In addition to the rotors, they added something called a plug board. A plug board was something in the front of the Enigma. We're going to see it in a minute. And it greatly increased the complexity of the encryption. Okay? I don't know if you can see this, but you can see that the letters here, here's the keyboard. I type the letter H, goes into the plug board, comes out as a W. That W is sent up here, goes through this mechanism, all the way through, back and forth, again comes down, and it comes out as, it comes out as the letter, because it goes around, comes out as the letter C. Now, right after that comes out, this moves again, and now it follows a different path. So if I press that letter again, it comes out, doesn't come out as C, it comes out as something else. That's why it was so complex, and that's why the Germans trusted it. This is what an Enigma machine looked like. This looks like the naval model because it has 4 rotors. However, the 4th rotor does not move. That's a manual rotor, and you have to move it manually, and that was one of the weaknesses of that machine. But nevertheless, there's the plug board in the front, the keys, and the lights above the keys that light up. Well, how did we break that? Well, the French had a spy with access to the German cipher materials, and that included the keys for 2 months in 1932. The French gave the material to the Poles, who used some of that material and the message traffic that they had collected in September and October to solve for the unknown wiring of the Enigma. They were then able to build their own Enigma machines. They could read some German messages, but the Enigma was designed to be secure even if the internal wiring was known. So even if you had an Enigma machine sitting there, the machine was designed to prevent you from being able to understand the message, even if you had an Enigma machine. So this was really quite a feat to be able to understand Enigma-generated messages. But then things got worse. As World War II loomed, the Germans increased the complexity of their Enigmas. Originally, the Enigmas came with 3 rotors, the 3 that you saw up on the top. And those rotors were interchangeable. You could put them in any order you wanted. Permutation of 3 rotors, 3 times 2, is 6. So there were 6 possible combinations. But then, or permutations, then the Germans added 2 additional rotors. Not in the machine, but that could be put in and swapped around. You still had a 3-rotor machine, but now it was 3 out of 5. And the number of possible combinations went up astronomically, and the Poles lost the ability to read any of the traffic. And they called for help from both the British and the French. Alan Turing, and Gordon Welchman helped crack the cipher that was generated by the Enigma. You might have seen the movie The Imitation Game, and that was the story of how Alan Turing cracked the Enigma. Gordon Welchman improved upon his plan. And so with much effort, they were able to read the encrypted traffic. The Enigma was slow. It could only do about a character a second, and it took 3 people on each side 3 people on the transmitter side, 3 people on the receiver side. One guy had to read the message. The next guy typed it into the Enigma. The third guy read the lights and wrote it on a piece of paper. Well, how many characters a second can you do? If you're good, maybe 1 character a second. Okay? The Enigma also didn't transmit. It didn't receive. All it did was encrypt and decrypt. It still had to take that paper, that encoded message, and give it to a radio guy to bang it out on a Morse code. So it was horribly labor intensive. And you couldn't use it for sending very long messages, small messages that were sent to the units in the field. Headquarters couldn't use it. They needed something else. Before we go to something else, let me debunk a myth. The Enigma cipher was never cracked. In spite of what you read, we have never cracked the Enigma. We read the Enigma ciphers only because of lazy and poorly trained operators. They took shortcuts, they failed to follow proper procedures, and one of the worst things, and I can't go into too much detail on how they use this, everybody loved to say Heil Hitler. Every message had Heil Hitler at the front or the back. Once you know what an encrypted message says, it's 1,000 times easier to get back to the key. And they love to use the word Heil Hitler. But if used correctly, the Enigmas are absolutely secure. There's nothing wrong with them. It's only the way the Germans use them. But they did have several flaws. The Enigmas weren't perfect. Press the letter E, 25 letters could come out, but not the letter E. The Enigma would never encrypt a character to itself. Now, the Germans knew that this was a weakness. I'll cover it in a minute. But they didn't think it was enough of a weakness to do anything about it. But this flaw, in combination with the operator failures that we just talked about, led to the cracking of the Enigma. Here's an interesting example. I think I have the text of a message. I say Heil Hitler, okay, in English, and here is the encrypted version of Heil Hitler. I slide those letters along, the encrypted, until no letter matches. When no letter matches, I may have a key. But if 1 letter matches, I know the Enigma could not do that. So that was a flaw. And that is how Alan Turing came up with a machine called the bomb, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, to automatically decrypt or help to decrypt. This is a techie slide. If you don't understand it, don't worry. If the rotor wiring is secret, the total number of possible encryption configurations has been calculated to be around 3 times 10 to the 114th power. That's a number so large that it has no name. Let me give you an example of how large that number is. 10 to the 114th power. The total number of atoms in the observable universe has been calculated to be about 10 to the 79th power. So that's how large 10 to the 114th is. It's an enormously large number. However, with known wiring and other operational constraints, the number is reduced to around 10 to the 23rd, still a very, very large number. Now, as I said, the Enigmas were tactical. They were put on ships for sea, but they couldn't keep up with the flow of traffic between Hitler and headquarters and between headquarters. So as good as the Enigma was, Hitler wanted something even more secure and a hell of a lot faster. The answer was another machine called the Lorenz. Lorenz was better. It could do 6 characters a second. I looked at the Lorenz and its internal mechanisms, and I don't think it would be very hard to double that speed. Pretty easy. They could, but they only used 6 characters per second during the war. It wasn't labor intensive. One person operated it, and the same machine that did the encryption also did the transmission. On the other end, when the encrypted message was received, it decrypted the message and printed it at the same time. One person instead of 6 people. The problem with the Lorenz was it was big. It was big, it was heavy. It took up half of the stage. It was an enormous machine. So it was difficult and time-consuming to move. So therefore, it was only used, there were only about 52 facilities that had the Lorenz versus hundreds and hundreds that had the Enigma. So it was used between Hitler and the Army Navy headquarters, and it was used between various unit headquarters. There was about 52 of them used. Lorenz carried strategic information, things that Hitler said, I want this division to attack here. The Enigma carried tactical information, and of course both types are needed in warfare. The Lorenz cipher was far harder to crack. Alan Turing had invented a machine called the bomb, and it did 20 times 6, 100, and there were 200 of those machines, so they could do probably 20,000, they could check 20,000 characters a second. Sounds like a lot. Sounds like a lot. When I was at the agency, I could do 7, 8 million instructions per second, and today they're talking about multi-trillion of operations per second. So 20,000 operations per second in a war is not all that fast, but it was still better than nothing. However, Tommy Flowers in the British Post Office invented the first programmable computer to crack the Lorenz cipher. And it was called Colossus. And it was invented specifically to crack that cipher. And it was the world's first programmable computer, but its existence was kept secret for 30 years. Britain even let the United States take credit for the first computer. I'm sure you all knew that ENIAC was the first computer in the world, right? And it was done at the University of Chicago, and it was done by us. We did it. 4 years before ENIAC became operational, Colossus became operational and was used to crack the Lorenz cipher. It was not a small machine. I think 10 of them, I believe, were built. And at the end of the war, 8 were completely demolished. Now, none exist. One has been reconstructed, but none of the originals exist. Take a look. This thing takes up a significant portion of a room. But it was the world's first programmable electronic computer, and I believe it used something like 1,500 vacuum tubes. So it didn't stay up for very long, 3, 4, 5 hours, and then it would fail, and you'd have to go and change tubes again. What about the Americans? What did we do? Well, we had a device that was similar to the Germans, but it was much, much more advanced. It's called SIGABA. I have no idea what SIGABA stands for, but it's called SIGABA. It was so valuable that the field units contained thermite bombs. Does everybody know what a thermite bomb is? It doesn't explode. It sits there and gets hot, very hot. I think it's around 3,500 degrees, and it's made of very simple materials. I think iron and aluminum? Magnesium, sorry. So it's very, very hot, very quickly, and in the event that the SIGABA was about to be captured, flip a switch, the bomb goes off and melts the entire unit, useless to the enemy. To the best of our knowledge, the SIGABA has never been broken, even though we continued to use it decades after the war. And it was one of the last electromechanical encryption machines in use. All later machines employed electronics. And I want to talk about one thing that occurred long after. This is the last topic we'll talk about. From the first use of encryption to the 1960s, every single method had one major failing. If I'm going to send you an encrypted message, what good is it going to do you if you can't read it? I have to first send you the decryption key. Julius Caesar had to go tell his people that he's sending the message to, look, move everything down 3 letters, and then you'll be able to read my message. The guy had to know that before he got the first message. Now, if I'm going to send you a key, that is very, very super secret, because if that key is intercepted by a spy or whoever, then from that point on, they can read every single message you send that guy, because they have the key. If you're 6,000 miles away, how do I get the key to you? I can't broadcast it through the radio. Everybody's listening. I could encode the key. The Germans did that with the Enigma. It failed. Again, it's beyond the scope of this talk to talk about how it did, but it failed. The only way that works is to strap a briefcase to a courier's arm and send them in a locked briefcase to where he has to go. When he comes back, you can say, did anybody see it? If he says no, then you know it got there safely. But that problem is, and that plague, what do you do with a ship at sea? How do you get the codes, the decryption keys to the guy at sea? Now remember, these boats, like a sub, they were out for 60, 70 days at a time. How do you get the codes to them? You can't. So what you have to do is you have to give them a stack of keys, and they leave with that stack. Now the Germans initially changed their keys at midnight every day. Every day they had a new key, and you went to a book, you looked it up, here's the daily key. Okay, that works fine. But in war, you got to change it more often. You actually have to change it sometimes. They did it 3 and 4 times a day toward the end of the war. They were so paranoid. So I have to get the key to you, and I have to do it securely, and I have to send a bunch of them. Now, England had a very good idea. They had weather boats stationed in the Atlantic Ocean. And several times a day, these boats would get on the radio, and they would transmit what the weather was like. So Germany could plan both their bombing raids as well as their defense based upon the weather. Somebody had a good idea. If they've got the keys on board that boat, and that boat is stationed there for 2 or 3 months at a time, if we could capture that boat, we could get the keys. And they did. They did it more than once. They actually captured the weather boats, and before they could radio that they were being boarded, we got the keys. That's one of the ways that we were able to break the Enigma. We captured the keys. We also did it from a submarine that we forced to the surface. The captain of that sub thought the sub was going down. He told everybody, hey, abandon ship, jump overboard. The sub didn't sink. Darn it, it didn't sink. It stayed up, and we put a boarding party on it. We found the keys. We brought them to Bletchley Park, where all the code breakers were. So another way we got keys. So this is a major, major problem. It was a problem for 2,500 years that had not been solved. But in the 60s and 70s, the solution was found by 2 independent groups working separately. It's a little bit complicated now, so try to follow me. In everything that we've done until this point, you had one key. You used that key to encrypt the message, and that same key to decrypt the message. It's been that way for 2,500 years. These guys came up with an interesting idea. It's called a trapdoor function, or a one-way function. It's a transformation that you can make to a code, or not to a code, but to a message. But once you make that transformation, even knowing the key, can't get it back. That's hard to believe because most people don't know about trapdoor functions. A regular function like multiply by 2. If I multiply the number by 2, you could divide the number by 2 and get the original number. If I told you to square a number, you could take the square root of the number, get back to the number. But there's a function that you can use, which you do to a number, and even if I told you what I did to that number, you couldn't get that number back. That's called a trapdoor function, or a one-way function. Well, what the hell good would that be? Now I've encrypted something using a trapdoor function, and I send it to you. Even if I told you the key, you couldn't get it back. What these guys did, they figured about another function, a different function, which could recover the original message. So now I have an interesting thing. I want to send you a secret message. John, what's your key that you want me to use? John sends me a key. I take that message. By the way, everybody's listening and they hear him. All right? He's using radio. Everybody knows that he has sent me that key. They know what the key is. I use that key to encrypt the message. I send him the message. Everybody hears that message. They have the key, they have the message, they can't do a damn thing with it. It's a one-way function. But he has a private key that nobody knows about except him. And he can now decode that message when nobody else can. That makes sense to people? Okay, there are two separate keys. One encodes, but you can't use it to decode. I send you the message. You have a private key, which you can use to then decode that message. So now, I can have every single message have a different key. All I have to do is ask you what your key is, your public key. You can tell me in the open, don't have to encode it or anything, let everybody hear. Doesn't make any difference. You send me your key, I encode the message, I send that message to you. Everybody gets the message, or the encrypted message, and everybody has the key, but they can't do anything with it. And the reason is because you have a private key. That was the single thing that changed cryptography, probably forever. Because now I can put a different key on every single message, and the cryptanalyst doesn't get enough material to work with. Throughout history, the cryptanalyst has had an advantage, or the code breaker had, an advantage over the code maker. But that has changed. I think from here on in and into the future, the advantage lies with the code makers. And I think code breaking is going to decrease in its capabilities until there is something on the horizon called a quantum computer. It's not too much is known about it. They don't have it working yet. There are pieces of it that work. When we finally get to the point of a quantum computer, that may be the thing that cryptanalysts can use then to now break even the most complex code. And I thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Have a good day.